Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Last week, I talked about the importance of stories, and stories have been what has been filling our Shabbats up to this point, with the exception of last week, Mishpatim, which was full of laws. The reason why stories are so important and why we relate to them is because we can identify with the characters in the story. We enjoy the drama. We can place ourselves in their positions, wonder what we're going to do. And that's exactly how we get taught certain important things in Torah, by seeing the characters do things that we want to emulate and seeing other characters do some things that we don't want to do. So we learn both ways. The other important thing about stories is that they create pictures in our mind. We create a movie when we listen or when we read. So keep that in mind, because I have given a title to this week's talk. I've called it Seeing is Believing. Why is that? Because this parsha stresses the importance of sight, and you'll see how that unfolds. And the sense of sight, arguably, is the most important sense. It has the greatest impact on our consciousness and memory. And we are in the infantile stage, having just left Egypt. Our memories are all of slavery, and our consciousness is undeveloped. But as Leon Cass says in his wonderful book on Exodus, this is the book that shows us how we become a nation, how we birth into our potential and realize some of that. This week's Parsha is Parshat Truma, which means offering or gift, or portion. There's a sense of elevation to it. So we think of an offering as something that is lifted up for a sacred purpose, and specifically to the donations that are going to be collected from Bnei Yisrael for the building of the Mishkan, which is the temporary structure that will be a dwelling place for God. The root of Truma is rum, which also means to be high or exalted. So you may be familiar with this root and with the word from the song Romemu, which we sing. It shares a common root, and it's the plural command form of exalt, referring to lifting up high and praising God. Much of what I'm going to share today is inspired by the teachings of Aviva Zornberg, and specifically her book on Exodus called The Particulars of Rapture. Just to give you a little perspective of where we are in our story, at the conclusion of last week's Parsha, Mishpatim, Moshe ascends the mountain to commune with God and to receive God's teachings directly. And for those of you who have a Tanakh, I'll be referring to and quoting from some sections, and you might want to follow along. The first quotation is from last week, chapter 24, verse 12. And God said to Moses, "Come up to me to the mountain and remain there, and I will give you the stone tablets, the law and the commandments, which I have written to instruct them." So Moshe and Joshua his servant arose, and Moshe ascended to the mount of God. And to the elders he said, "Wait for us here until we return to you, and here Aaron and Hur are with you. Whoever has a case, let him go to them." And Moshe went up the mountain, and the cloud covered the mountain. And the glory of God rested on Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it for 6 days. And God called to Moshe on the 7th day from within the cloud, and the appearance of the glory of God was like a consuming fire atop the mountain before the eyes of the children of Israel. And Moshe came within the cloud, and he went up the mountain, and Moshe was upon the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. So we've got this very dramatic image at the end of last week's Parsha of Moshe ascending the mountain, and we can imagine what the people were seeing standing at the base of the mountain. They were seeing the cloud on top of the mountain, Moshe gradually disappearing, And then this consuming fire also that was part of the top of the mountain. So we tend to think, well, what went on with Moshe at the top of the mountain? And here's where Aviva Zornberg gives us a different perspective. She shifts the point of view to the Israelites and what they saw and how imposing of a sight this is. So continuing with what I mentioned before about seeing ourselves in every character of the story, I try to imagine the range of the feelings that the people were experiencing as they watch Moshe disappear. And I imagine that they are suffering from different degrees of separation anxiety, which we know will come to a dramatic point right before the building of the golden calf. So Moshe is up on the mountain receiving specific instructions on the materials for and the building of the Mishkan. These instructions are detailed enough to be fully rendered in pictures and in models. And perhaps if there's time at the end, I'll show you some pictures of what people have done when they've built models exactly per the blueprint specs. In fact, these are God's blueprints. But Moshe is not a building contractor or a visual artist, so it's very interesting. The Parsha is sprinkled with references to God implanting visions of what Moshe is supposed to have rendered in Moshe's head. So we get a description of the materials and an exact description of how things are supposed to be built. And then at various points in our Parsha, it says that God is sharing the vision of God's vision within Moshe's mind. So we see how sight is so important. It's not enough just for God to describe, no matter how detailed, what it is that he wants rendered in the building of the Mishkan and what goes inside the Mishkan. He also plants visions of what the end product is supposed to look like inside Moshe's head. So after listing all the materials to be used, God explains the purpose of the structure in a very famous pasuk at 25:8. And they shall make me a sanctuary, and I will dwell in their midst. It's a beautiful statement of purpose and a poetic description of God's intention. I quote for you from the Chabad translation. They shall make me a sanctuary and I will dwell in their midst. But there is extensive midrash and commentary on this verse, and specifically the word betocham, which can also mean in them or within them. So we can read this, they shall make me a sanctuary and I will dwell within them, meaning inside each one of us. An allusion to a place that goes beyond a physical structure and a reference to God taking up residence inside each one of us. Just a beautiful image. So we've been freed from Egypt. Our basic needs are being cared for. We've experienced the revelation at Sinai. And then last week, a whole slew of laws were shared with us in Mishpatim. So what is next? And what is the connection with the revelation? And with Torah and the building of the Mishkan? How do these things connect with each other, and why does one follow the other? So first of all, why a mikdash, which is the Hebrew word for sanctuary? What is it and why now? You'll see that mikdash shares a root with kodesh, sacred. So a mikdash is a sanctuary, a holy place containing holy things, holy enough for the presence of God to dwell. The name of the sanctuary, however, is the Mishkan, which shares a root with Shekhinah. Now we'll know from studying with Rabbi Finley and going over the diagram of the Kabbalah tree that Shekhinah is one of the names of God and an attribute of God on the Kabbalah tree. In fact, the 10th Sphira, if we remember the schemata of the Kabbalah tree. And Shekhinah describes God's presence in our world. The one that is most accessible, it is the 10th, it is the farthest down. So it is the one closest to me, the axis mundi, the one that then can most easily straddle God's realm with our realm, and one that we can most easily access from our realm. So imagine that this is a point of intersection. And if the Mishkan is the place for the Shekhinah, then that is the place where separation stops and where there can be some communion, meaning normally God's world and our world do not intersect in a physical way, but the Mishkan is a place where we can invite God in. So, for example, in the story of creation in Lurianic Kabbalah, God created a space in God's world through the process of tzimtzum, which we have learned is a process of contraction, of contracting God's infinite space to make room for something that isn't infinite, for the finite, for our universe, a place for mankind with all the attendant problems and opportunities that are created by free will and potential. Now, God wants us to create a space for God, mirroring the act of creation itself. So imagine, God created at the beginning of Genesis, and now we are being asked to create in a huge way, make a space for God, contract a space from our finite space and make a little infinite space for God. And even though very soon, two weeks from now, we will have the narrative of the sin of the golden calf, you should know that this building and completion of the Mishkan provides a dramatic climax to the end of Sefer Shemot. So this is a huge holy purpose that we are undertaking now. Of course, we don't know about it yet. We're standing at the bottom of the mountain. Moshe's getting the instructions directly from God that he will then share with us. But for now, this is all a conversation between Moshe and God. So previously, I talked about the courage, the will, and the skill that was needed to leave Egypt and reject the comfort and predictability of slavery. We think of slavery as something that we wouldn't necessarily embrace, but if we look at it metaphorically, it's something that we are tethered to and reluctant to leave because it is comfortable and predictable and known, and because it can be a place where we don't have responsibility, we don't have to make choices, things are taken care of for us. We understand better the huge draw of a slavery type of situation. So think of that, not just actually, but metaphorically, what it took for us to reject the comfort and predictability of life in Egypt. In fact, as I mentioned last night, the Midrash tells us that 4/5 of us remained behind. That's how strong the pull is to something familiar and known. So the will and the skill and the courage to leave something, no matter how tragic, difficult, problematic it is great. And great credit needs to be given to people that do that. But that's different from the courage, the skill, and the will to go forward then into the unknown with the ultimate destination of the promised land and the responsibilities that go with that, and the burden of setting up a just society, providing for ourselves, figuring out laws, and implementing them, all the problems of living in close proximity to other people who also want to live free and make their own choices. As I mentioned last night, thinking about this week, I realized that there is a third journey that we are on and that the Israelites are on. And that is the journey of experiencing life in the Bamidbar. And of course, that's the journey that takes up most of the time. Leaving took days. Getting to the brink of the Jordan to cross over, that happened in a day as well. The intervening time was approximately 38 years. That's the bulk of the journey, and that's the journey of our life. That's why I used the common symbol of birth and death dates on a tombstone with the hyphen representing the whole span of life that happens in between, the important parts. To see life as a series of goals is very often a recipe to miss out on life happening right now, an appreciation of the small mundane things that make up our day-to-day existence. For the Israelites, it's those years, those 38 years that I mentioned, between the journey from and the journey toward. And during this 38 years, we have an evolution towards independence, individuation, creativity, and responsibility. It is the joy of working together with a common purpose while discovering, acknowledging, and developing our particular skills and talents that we get to witness now, and especially with the building of the Mishkan. Imagine in slavery, all you needed to know was how to do the bidding of those who had enslaved you, and what your skills were directly related to the building of whatever you were supposed to pick, making of the bricks, building of the pyramids, whatever it was. Now, the Israelites have to discover the whole range of talents and skills that they possess, because all of that will come to fruition in being selected for certain tasks for the Mishkan and for realizing its ultimate creation. So that's why the Mishkan is necessary right now. We needed to discover in ourselves, what are my talents? What are my skills? What do I love to do? Even including, what do I love to do, but I don't know how to do it yet. Just because we're good at something doesn't mean we love it. And just because we love something doesn't mean that we're good at it. So this was a time for us to discover in ourselves those talents that we could develop in order to give our services to the Mishkan. We gather materials for it. We need to figure out how to construct and assemble it, and also to beautify it. Another interesting thing that I noticed this week about, I read ahead a little, I confess, about the actual building of the Mishkan, because as I said, this week we're only looking at the instructions for it, is that during this entire project, to my astonishment, there were no complaints by the Israelites. There were no expressions of regret. So to me, what a beautiful lesson in having a common purpose and being able to flex your muscles and express your creativity, do a job well, be creative. That will push out some of the feelings of anxiety and despair and regret and all the other negativity that we have already witnessed in the short time that we've left Egypt and we're in the Bamidbar. So to me, a common purpose can be uplifting and unifying. Pride in the accomplishment can be a sustaining high. In all the stories in Torah, I don't believe there is another period of sustained satisfaction and happiness like there is in this time of constructing the Mishkan. Think about it. Every other place, yes, we do have high points, but they are immediately followed by low points. And the low points usually include complaining and regret, and even complaints when there's nothing to complain about. In fact, in a few weeks, we'll read about the people having to look around to find a source to complain for, that they didn't even have anything specific that was making them unhappy. But apparently during a period of too much time on their hands, they looked around and tried to find a source of dissatisfaction. Not so during the building of the Mishkan. So this 38 years to me is not just an interim period where we're looking forward to a goal. It's really the realization of those important things that we needed to develop in this time. we needed a more elevated consciousness. We needed to know how to rely on ourselves, understand what we were made of, that we could accomplish certain goals on our own, solve problems, work together. And this whole idea of not just focusing on a destination, I think is important, because every year when we read the story of Moshe's life, we are so sad that he was not able to enter the promised land, that for a seemingly small transgression, and we won't go into that here, because whether the transgression was small or large, really, the lesson is the same. But for a seemingly small transgression, he was denied entry into the promised land, and we tend to focus on that. But this year, I focus on everything that he accomplished in the 38 years. And not just on the final bit of sadness. The reason why that's interesting is that Zornberg also wrote another book, biography of Moshe, that she calls Moses, A Human Life. It's a wonderful little book. And before the book, she quotes Kafka, who you may know is an early 20th century writer, originally from Czechoslovakia. I had read him when I was very young, didn't realize that he was Jewish. Turns out that he's Jewish. Amazing coincidence, not so amazing. But she puts a quote in this biography of Moshe, and here it is. It's beautiful, and you'll see how it illustrates my whole point about how important the hyphen is, the journey is. He is on track of Canaan all his life. It is incredible that he should see the land, talking about Moshe, it is incredible that he should see the land only when on the verge of death. The dying vision of it can only be intended to illustrate how incomplete a moment is human life. Incomplete because a life like this could last forever and still be nothing but a moment. Moses fails to enter Canaan, not because his life is too short, but because it is a human life. And that's a quote from Kafka's diaries. What that tells me is that if you focus on an endpoint, if you make your life just about one destination, and for whatever reason, either you don't live long enough, or in this case with Moshe, he's denied entry into the promised land, then you sum up your life as a disappointment. You're really selling yourself short, and you're missing the point, not only that life is a series of destinations, but that the journey is what can be invigorating and transforming. So I wanted to share that with you. For me, it helps to mitigate the disappointment that I feel every year when Moshe is denied entry. And perhaps I can even get to the point where I'm not disappointed at all, because I can embrace his life and all of his accomplishments up to that moment. So why does the timing of the Mishkan make sense right now? Well, we go back to Parshat Yitro. And at 19:5, for those of you who have your Tanakh and want to follow along with me, we read, "And now, if you hearken well to me and observe my covenant, you shall be to me the most beloved treasure of all peoples. For mine is the entire world. You shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." Another beautiful passage from Torah, and a beautiful promise that God makes to us. So we hear this promise, and then we affirm everything that Hashem has spoken we shall do. We make that affirmation even before we're given the Torah. And then we make it again after the revelation when we say, Na'aseh v'nishma, everything that Hashem has said we will do and we will hearken to or obey or listen to. It's multiple meanings of Shema that comprise all of that. So these two affirmations are our agreement to accept the conditions of God's promises. So what happens as a result? Part of God's promise that I just read is that we will be a holy nation. So we have been sanctified. We are a kingdom of priests. from this elevated state, now we merit creating holiness ourselves. And what is our first expression of creating holiness? The creation of the Mishkan. Another reason that the Mishkan becomes a necessary rung in the ladder of our evolution is because we are dependent on the visual. We need signs, we need symbols, visual reminders, concrete things to look at. For example, tzitzit. We need a story. We need a story because by hearing a story, we translate words into pictures in our mind. And just like we needed stories in order to visualize all the characters we inhabit in Torah as human beings, we need a Mishkan in order to remind ourselves that God is in the world with us and wants to dwell inside of us. But the sense of sight is problematic and fraught with danger, as we know. For example, way back in the beginning of Genesis, we have the story of Adam and Eve. And when Eve is tempted by the snake tells her, God knows that on the day you eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, your eyes will be opened. And in the very next verse we read, and the woman saw that the tree was good for eating and that it was a delight to the eyes and that the tree was desirable as a means to wisdom. Such an interesting reaction. And an interesting reaction that Chava, that Eve doesn't say that the tree was a means to wisdom as the first thing that seduced her. No, it was that she saw the tree was good for eating and it was a delight to the eyes. Only third in this hierarchy does she say that it was a means to wisdom, or does she realize that it was a means of wisdom? So we see how important the sense of sight is way back in the beginning of Torah. And what does it do here? Well, it leads us astray. So much of what we read about in Torah that has to do with what we see leads us astray. So later on, actually, in a couple of weeks, we'll be reading in Parshat Shalach, after the sin of the spies, we read about this mitzvah of tzitzit. And I'm going to quote there, if you want to go along with me. This is in Vayikra, in the next book, starting at 1537. And God spoke to Moshe, saying, speak to the children of Israel, and you shall say to them that they shall make for themselves fringes on the corners of their garments throughout their generations, and they shall affix a thread of sky blue wool on the fringe of each corner. This shall be fringes for you, and when you see it, you will remember all of the commandments of God to perform them. And you shall not wander after your hearts and after your eyes, after which you are going astray. That you shall remember and perform all my commandments, and you shall be holy to your God. I am Hashem, your God, who took you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. I am Hashem, your God. So to me, the important line here, the one that I am talking about, is how easy it is for us to wander after our hearts and after our eyes, after which you will go astray. So we know that the lev, the heart, we translate, and Rabbi Finley has taught repeatedly, that the lev is the ego mind, that part of ourselves which very often replaces the will of God. And of course, our eyes, that we shall not wander after our eyes, that is how seductive the visual can be. So the danger of being led astray by the visual is more acute than any other senses. We have a perfect example of this coming up in Parsha Ki Tisa, which is the Parsha that contains the sin of the golden calf. So Moshe is still up on the mountain, still where he is at the beginning of our Parsha today. He's receiving Torah from God, the oral Torah, the explanation of everything. And if you want to follow along with me here, you can go to 32:7, still in Sefer Shemot. And God said to Moses, go, descend, for your people that you have brought up from the land of Egypt have acted corruptly. They have quickly turned away from the path that I have commanded them. They have made themselves a molten calf, and they have prostrated themselves before it, slaughtered sacrifices to it, and said, these are your gods, O Israel, who have brought you up from the land of Egypt. So God is telling Moshe this, you better get down the mountain and look what the people are doing. God here, and Moshe hears this. Then after that, God says to Moshe that God will annihilate the people, start over with Moshe and make him a great nation. To which Moshe responds, don't do this, God. Don't. He implores God on behalf of the people and takes the people's side. However, here's the key point. When Moshe does then descend the mountain himself and sees for himself what God had described to him, Moshe's anger flares up. In fact, the same words are used when God sees what the people are doing on top of the mountain. Torah teaches us that God's anger flared. Then God tells Moshe what God had seen, so that Moshe hears this story audibly. But we only read that Moshe's anger flares up when he sees it for himself. So that's how important it is for sight to have an impact on our emotional reactions. So what does Moshe do? Moshe gets angry the same way that God did, and Moshe throws down the tablets and shatters them, confronts Aaron, makes accusations. So what is to be learned from this? That hearing about what the Israelites are doing is very different from seeing it. Even if the hearing version matches up factually exactly with the vision, which it did. So the visual touches us emotionally in a different way, like here, activating anger and an anger response in Moshe. And that is what we need to be aware of. As a little aside, when we do build the Mishkan, and we do have an ark, and the ark is built and put inside the holiest place, we're taught that there's three things that are put in the ark. A jar of manna, we've already gotten the instruction in Torah to do that. That was a few weeks ago. Aaron's staff, and the tablets of the Ten Commandments. So to me, why these three things? What do they represent? I was thinking about that this week and doing a little research on that. Well, to me, the manna represents God taking care of us, taking care of our needs, our basic need of survival, of having something to eat, of giving us nourishment the way a parent nourishes a child. So to me, the manna is a symbol of God's love and caring, chesed, which is the first point on the accessible part of the Kabbalah tree. We know that the upper three are difficult or impossible to fathom. It's Keter, Chochmah, and Bina, but the lower seven are the ones that we can try to fathom and incorporate into our lives. So the first one of the lower seven is Chesed, which is loving kindness. So I associate the manna with that, and therefore it is a symbol of God's loving kindness. The staff of Aaron, to me, represents not only the priesthood, but a staff in terms of discipline and guidance and justice. After all, Moshe is also from the tribe of Levi, just like Aaron. And this is the priestly class, and these are the judges that are supposed to understand and implement the law. So I associate the symbol of the staff of Aaron with Gevurah, which is the next of the lower 7 on the Kabbalah tree. And what then does the symbol of the Luchot, the tablets of the 10 Commandments, represent? Well, we know that the third sphera of the lower 7 is called Tiferet, which is beauty and splendor. But it's also known as Emet, Tiferet Emet. And what is Emet? Emet is truth. So to me, including the symbol of the 10 Commandments for safekeeping inside the ark is a symbol of the Emet, the truth of the law. Going back to the benefits of the visual experience, there are many, even though they're fraught with danger. We can create a visual memory and recall it in our mind's eye. This can produce the faith that we need to access when the experience has disappeared. So what do I mean by that? Memory can produce an imprint, an image, and replaces this vacuum of disappearance once the actual experience is no longer taking place. This is important because it becomes the mechanism of understanding the concept that when we're told that we were all present at Sinai for the revelation, and that this is for every generation, including us here and now, how do we understand that to be true? Well, I understand it because of this imprint of an image creating a memory. We weren't physically there at Sinai, but we can recall it. And how does God tell us that this takes place? Because we're given the instruction to teach our children and our children's children. So this then is another important way that we absorb certain truths and lessons through stories. If we tell these stories from generation to generation, and I believe the first commandment actually is a commandment to tell our story. If we keep these stories alive and therefore the visions alive, and we imprint the visions in our memory, then it is as if we were there. We conjure images that become part of our personal history. For that reason, this Parsha often coincides, as it does this year, with the second Shabbat leading up to Pesach, which is Shabbat Zachor, the Shabbat of remembering. We know that we have 4 special Shabbatot that lead up to Pesach. This is the second one. Remembering is a key to winning the battle against fear, doubt, and ingratitude. Why do I say that? Because if we remember not only the law and what we've been taught, but we remember our stories, then it's harder for fear to seep in, for doubt to take over, for ingratitude to replace gratitude. Remembering is what enables us to know how to answer the difficult questions in life that cannot be answered by what should I do, but can only be answered by who am I?